Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I would like to do an overview and review of the Earthsea series by Ursula K. Le Guin. So the Earthsea series is a classic fantasy series of 6 books. There are 5 novels in it and 1 collection of short stories. The first of the novels, called A Wizard of Earthsea, was published in 1968, and the last novel was published in 2001. So Ursula Le Guin wrote the books over a long period of her career. And she actually wrote the first novel, A Wizard of Earthsea, without any intention of ever writing a sequel, but obviously, she did. I read the Earthsea books in this edition, and this is called The Books of Earthsea, the complete illustrated edition, with illustrations by Charles Vess. And it's a lovely edition. It's a little bit cumbersome because it's gigantic, but it has an afterword for each individual volume, and also an essay at the very end of the book called Earthsea Revisioned. And those are all very interesting pieces because Ursula Le Guin kind of tracks her progress as she wrote the books and talks about how her thinking developed as she wrote them, what was going on in her life and the literary world that influenced her writing of them. And that's why I would kind of recommend this volume, although I personally don't love bind-ups like this because they're so huge and cumbersome, but this does have some really interesting pieces by Le Guin outside of the books themselves. But anyway, the Earthsea series is a classic fantasy series, definitely classic, definitely influential. Not as well known, I don't think, in the general public as something like The Lord of the Rings or Dune, perhaps. But really, I think after my reading of them, I think it absolutely stands as an equal achievement with a work like The Lord of the Rings or Dune. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the world in which Earthsea takes place, just to give you a little background on where it takes place and what it's like. And then I want to do quick kind of reviews of each of the 6 books in the series. So Earthsea takes place in an archipelago of islands, which are just called Earthsea. The largest of the islands is called Havnor, and this is an island from which historically these islands have been ruled by a king. But at the beginning of the series, in the first book, A Wizard of Earthsea, there hasn't been a king for several centuries. And one other island that becomes very important in the series is the island of Gaunt. That is the island where the protagonist of the first novel, Ged, is from. And it's where a lot of action throughout the books takes place. But in this archipelago, what's interesting about Earthsea as a fantasy series is that the people in this archipelago are largely dark-skinned rather than light-skinned. Ursula Le Guin, when she set out to write these books, she consciously wanted to push back against the kind of assumption in a lot of fantasy literature, as she saw it, the assumption that the characters were all going to be white and European, and that the technology level would be roughly around the Middle Ages. So the vast majority of the characters in this series are dark-skinned, roughly equivalent in their skin tone to Native Americans, actually. But to the east of the central part of Earthsea that's ruled by Havnor is another sort of smaller archipelago of islands called the Kargad Lands, or Kargad Islands. And these islands are occupied by people who are light-skinned. And they're viewed as very barbaric, and they periodically go on raids on the other parts of Earthsea. And so you can see in that dynamic kind of an inversion of the association of being dark-skinned with barbarity and light-skinned with civilization, and she kind of reverses that. But then she also kind of unreverses it to a certain degree later in the later books. I can't go much into that because it's a spoiler, but it's an interesting part of the Earthsea universe that Le Guin decides to make most of the central characters these dark-skinned people. And then, in addition to the central parts of Earthsea, and then you have the Kargad lands to the west, to the east, you have in the west, very far west, you have islands that are occupied by dragons. And dragons in Le Guin's world are very spiritual, are very powerful, are not by any means malevolent, but also not really benevolent. They are extremely feared, but they also tend to keep to themselves, and they have kind of a connection with the earth that has been lost by humans, and so they have that kind of deeper connection with nature than humans do. And another interesting aspect of the Earthsea world is that technology is roughly around the equivalent of the Iron Age here on Earth, so that the Iron Age ended around 500 BC. So the technology level is a bit more primitive, so-called, than we're used to seeing in fantasy. You know, usually when we look at fantasy, we see something like The Lord of the Rings, which is roughly in the High Middle Ages. Another major influence on the Earthsea books is Taoist philosophy. Ursula Le Guin was very influenced by Taoism. She even published her own translation of the Tao Te Ching, which is the central text in Taoism as a religion. And something that I do love about the Earthsea books is just how philosophical they are. They're probably more philosophical in nature than any other fantasy books that I've read. I'm not super well read in the fantasy genre, but they certainly do have more of a philosophical bent to them than I'm used to expecting from the fantasy genre. So that's a little bit of background on the world of Earthsea for you. I will get into some more things as I review each individual book, and with that said, I will jump right into my take on each individual book in the series. So there are 6 books, so buckle up. I'm going to be talking about 6 books. So the first book was called A Wizard of Earthsea. It was published in 1968, and it was written explicitly as a young adult novel. Now, Le Guin talks in the essays in this volume a lot about her kind of skepticism of young adult as a label for a genre, but she did explicitly write this novel for young adults. And she also, interestingly, wrote it without ever intending to write a sequel. But with that said, A Wizard of Earthsea is probably the most conventional of all the books of Earthsea in terms of what we expect from the fantasy genre. So what it's about a young boy named Ged, or Sparrowhawk, he's also known as, who's born on the island of Gaunt, which I mentioned earlier would become very important in the series. And when he's very young, when he's about 15 at the beginning of the story, he shows exceptional magical abilities. In this world of Earthsea, there are wizards and magic, and Ged shows exceptional talent with magic very early on. And so he is sort of taken in by a mage named Ogion, who lives on the island of Gaunt, to be trained as a wizard by him. But Ged eventually kind of loses patience with the way that Ogion teaches magic. He teaches it in a very slow-paced, methodical, meditative way, and Ged is young and impatient. So what Ogion decides to do is he sends him off to Roke. And Roke is on a different island, and it's this school explicitly for teaching wizards. And what happens at Roke is Ged is admired for his talent and his abilities, but he is also very proud and arrogant. And he ends up getting into a fight with a fellow student, and amid that fight, he casts a spell that accidentally summons this demon who basically haunts Ged for the rest of the novel. And the rest of the novel is his struggle to overcome that demon, sort of. And so I will say right off the bat that A Wizard of Earthsea is actually my least favorite of the 6 books. I actually really disliked it the first time that I read it. I really hated the writing. I thought it was so poorly written. And a part of me wonders whether I just blew a fuse and made a mistake while I was reading it, whether I was just not in the right mindset while I read it. Because, as I said before, I think that the Earthsea books as a whole are absolutely an equal achievement to Dune or The Lord of the Rings or those other classic fantasy series and books. So it's odd that, for me, the series got off to such an inauspicious start. But what I do like about the story of A Wizard of Earthsea is that even though there is kind of a conventional hero's quest, definitely, as I said, it is the most conventional novel in terms of what we expect from a fantasy book, the journey is more about Ged as a person. It's more of an internal journey into his own character than it is about destroying the One Ring and saving Middle-earth or something like this. And that's what I love about the Earthsea books as a whole, is that a lot of them do have a kind of fantasy quest that the characters go on, but they are much more character studies than they are about saving the world or something like this. And so that is something that in retrospect I do really like about A Wizard of Earthsea. But I will say that I did not like the writing, that I thought it was the weakest of the books in that regard. Now, I wonder whether, again, I blew a fuse, but it's also possible that Ursula Le Guin just improved a lot between A Wizard of Earthsea and the second book, which is called The Tombs of Atuan. And so The Tombs of Atuan, which was published in 1970, 2 years later, is a very different book from A Wizard of Earthsea. It does not have a traditional hero's journey structure to it, and one of the things you learn in the essays in this volume is that was a self-conscious choice on Le Guin's part. She wanted to kind of push back against this very male-centric, white-centric hero's journey idea that's present in a lot of fantasy literature and in a lot of epics from throughout the Western canon. And so the Tombs of Atuan takes place in that region of the Earthsea world called Kargad, in those so-called barbaric lands. And it takes place at a location called the Tombs of Atuan. And the main character is a woman named, at the beginning of the novel, she's named Arha. She later takes on a different name called Tanar. And she is the priestess of the Nameless Ones, as it's called in Kargad. And so this temple is called the Tombs of Atuan. And Tanar was taken from her family when she was about 5 years old because she was believed to be the reincarnation of this priestess. This rank of this priestess is decided on kind of in a similar way as the new Dalai Lama is found. They look for a young child who might be the reincarnation of that priestess. And so she doesn't know her family, and she's raised in this temple in this very woman-centric but also very repressive environment where her actions are very restricted. You know, it's what's interesting about the Tombs of Atuan is that on the one hand, Tanar holds this hallowed, powerful, holy position, but on the other hand, she's very restricted in what she can actually do with herself, because she can't leave, she can't talk to men who aren't eunuchs, who are men who have been castrated, and so she's very restricted in her movements, and this novel is kind of the story of her breaking free from that very repressive society, and I think definitely you can see that as symbolic of a woman breaking free from the restrictions put on women. And so this sort of opens up a theme in the Earthsea books of talking about women's roles versus men's roles. So that's a big theme. But The Tombs of Atuan for me was great. It was, I thought at the time, light years better than Wizard of Earthsea. And so I really loved it. And I loved the subversion of the typical story you see in fantasy. So Tombs of Atuan, I love it. And then we come to the third novel, and that is called The Farthest Shore. It was published in 1972, so 2 years, again, after the previous one. And this one, once again, features Ged, or Sparrowhawk, from the first novel, and he's now a grown man, and I won't tell you any more about that to avoid spoilers, but he teams up with a younger man named Aaron, or Aaron, I'm not sure how you're supposed to pronounce his name, but he teams up with this young man named Aaron to solve this mystery that has come up. There's been this situation across Earthsea that on some islands of Earthsea, magic has begun to disappear, and no one really knows why. And so Ged teams up with Aaron to figure out why that is. And that's the story, essentially. And again, it has more of a conventional journey, more of a conventional quest, as A Wizard of Earthsea did. But again, it's very much a journey inside of the characters' heads. You know, Ged is now much older than he was in the first book, much wiser, and Aaron, you can see, learns a lot from him. And a big theme that comes up in The Farthest Shore that will also become exponentially more important as the later books move on, is this idea of balance with nature, this idea of harmony in nature, which comes very much from Taoism. And what comes out in particular is how human beings are very much out of balance with nature because of an excess of as I think Ged at one point puts it, unchecked desire. And the human beings in the story are often contrasted with the dragons in the story, who are completely in balance with nature. But also other animals are portrayed as being in balance with nature. And so that's a major philosophical idea that is important in the Earthsea books that really starts to come out in a major way in The Farthest Shore. And then we come to the fourth book, Tejanu, and that wasn't published until 1990, so 18 years it took Ursula Le Guin to write Tejanu. And sometimes the first 3 books in the Earthsea series are called a trilogy, and the second set of 3 are called a trilogy on their own. And I think that's fair, because the second set of 3 is very different in tone, again, from the first 3. But really, I personally like to see them all as one big story. But so we come to Tejanu, published in 1990, and this returns again to Tanar from the second book, The Tombs of Atuan. And she's now middle-aged. In fact, I think she's on the older side in this book. She's moved to Gaunt, the island where Ged was from, and she's kind of built a life for herself, built a regular domestic life for herself. She took a different name and got married and had 2 kids. And then her husband died, her children moved out, and so she's now kind of a widow living by herself at the beginning of this novel. But what happens, the main action, such as it is in this novel, is that Tanar takes in this very young girl who's been severely abused. This girl is maybe 4 or 5 years old at the beginning of the story. She's been sexually abused, she has been burned, and so she's ostracized by a lot of people in this society, which regards her physical deformity as some reflection on her character, or some reflection on her being perhaps cursed. But Tanar takes her in, takes care of her, and Ged also appears in this book, and their relationship is explored much more. Ged does make an appearance in the Tombs of Atuan. I didn't mention it earlier because I want to avoid as many spoilers as possible. That's difficult to do when you're reviewing an entire series, but their relationship is explored very in-depth, as is both of their relationship with the young girl who is named Theru. And this novel is probably my favorite in the Earthsea series. It's a lot of people's least favorite, which is interesting, but what I love about this novel is that it really is a chamber drama. It's as close as a fantasy series could come to a chamber drama that's just about people's relationships with each other and people's regrets and feelings about their lives and their past and their future. And that's what I love about it. And what I love about it too is that it starts to really bring those issues of gender to the forefront, because Tanar, it is revealed, has magical abilities, but she chooses not to use them. She chose a more domestic, conventional life. And this contrast between the conventional domestic life of a woman and the sort of powerful hero's life of a man are contrasted and compared, and there are no easy answers between what's better or what's worse, or if either one is better or worse. But they're compared and contrasted in this story in, I think, really interesting ways. And what also comes out in this novel is the fact that only men are allowed to become wizards in this world. And that becomes a bigger issue as these stories go on. Women do have magical abilities, but they are not allowed to be trained as wizards. And so that becomes a big aspect of these later novels. But I just love the way that Tejanu really is just a character study, just about relationships, and I think that's what makes it so very powerful. And then we come to the 5th book, which was published in 2001. Actually, the 5th and 6th book were both published in 2001. So the 5th book in the series is called The Tales from Earthsea, and this is actually a collection of short stories, so it's difficult for me to review the whole thing here, but a number of the stories do relate to characters we know from the series. One of them features Ogion, the wizard who first started teaching Ged in the first book. Another one, the last one in the book, called Dragonfly, also is sort of the connecting narrative tissue between Tejanu and the Other Wind. But then other stories take place hundreds of years before the Earthsea books ever took place. And what I love about these stories is two things. One is that each one, even though it's a short story, is still a brilliant character study of an individual from some point in time. For me, collections of short stories have never been my strong suit. I've never loved them, but the character studies in this one were so penetrating and subtle and interesting. And the other thing that I think these stories do is they really flesh out the world of Earthsea really well. They give you a lot of history, a lot of historical background. There is a piece at the end of Tales from Earthsea called A Description of Earthsea. And in this edition, that's about 20 pages long. And I think that that piece can be compared to the appendices to The Lord of the Rings, where it's kind of giving you histories, background, additional stories. And so A Description of Earthsea is giving you a lot about the history of Earthsea, a lot about the different cultures, about the Kargod lands, about the central parts of Earthsea, about the dragons, the origins of different languages, about magic, how magic is used in Earthsea, and so on and so forth. And that, at first I was afraid to read that because I was thinking it might be rather boring. I've actually myself never read the appendices from The Lord of the Rings because I just think 100 pages of history and background would be a little bit boring. But a description of Earthsea, for one thing, is very, very short. So even if you do find it a little bit dull, it's very short. But second, I think it too really enriches your view of what happens in the books. Both the last book that has yet to come, The Other Wind, and the previous books. So this is definitely a fantasy series where I think that the earlier books in the series would strike you in a different light upon a reread, in light of what happens in the other books. So, Tales from Earthsea, I think, is great. I love it. And I would say don't skip it. There are some people who skip it because it's a collection of short stories and because they're not all connected to the main thread of the story. I would say that's a mistake, again, because they enrich the world so much, and because there is that one story, Dragonfly, which connects the Tejanu to the last book, The Other Wind. And speaking of The Other Wind, I can now finally talk about the sixth book. And so that was published also in 2001, as I said before. And I won't give away too much about what happens in this book, because it would be really difficult for me to do any kind of plot summary of this book without spoiling a lot from the other books. And I've already done my best to do some summary of what goes on in the books without spoiling too much. And so but with this book, that becomes almost impossible. But I will suffice it to say that it is, I think, a very fitting and very moving ending to the Earthsea series. It's not my favorite by any means. I think it maybe is a little bit more slow going than it should be. I think the way that the resolution happens is somewhat anticlimactic, but those are quibbles more than they are criticisms. I found the ending very, very moving. It's such a perfect ending, in my opinion. The very last scene, I think, is perfect, and I think it's lovely. And so those are the 6 Earthsea books. There are, in this volume, some additional short stories that are not connected all that much with the original books. I haven't talked about them because I haven't read them yet, but they're there. They're in this volume. I presumably will read them at some point, but I wanted to talk about the main Earthsea series. I think if you're into fantasy or if you're into just literature in general, this would be a great read. I think the writing is superb. Barring my reservations about the first book, I think the writing is superb. There are some beautiful sentences in it, some beautiful quotes. And yeah, I can wholeheartedly recommend the Earthsea series. Personally, I think of Earthsea as one big work, and that's how Guin herself says that she saw it, as one big work rather than as a series of 6 books. And that's really how I see it as well. That's how I see The Lord of the Rings, too. A lot of people call it the Lord of the Rings series. I don't think of it that way. I think of it as one book that has 3 parts, and I think of this as one big epic that has 6 parts. And I think seen as that, it is a huge achievement to stand beside The Lord of the Rings and other great works of literature. Not only fantasy literature, but literature in general. So, anyway, that is the Earthsea books. That's my take on the Earthsea books. I hope you enjoyed. If you have read these books, please give me your thoughts. If you have recommendations for fantasy or science fiction books that I should read because knowing that I've liked these books, then I'd love to hear those as well. But anyway, I will leave it all at that and talk to you all later. Bye.